Are we okay here? Okay, very good. So my book is titled The Voltage Effect, and I'll talk a little bit later about what does the voltage effect mean, because a lot of you might wonder, is this an engineering book? It's not an engineering book, but I want you to reflect on one question. And that question is, think about one reason why we haven't solved poverty. Now, I understand this is a multidimensional problem, and there are several reasons. But if we all put in one particular idea about why haven't we solved poverty, why haven't we solved public education problems in the Western world, what about discrimination, what about climate change? When I lecture around the world, the young minds continuously ask me, Professor, you have been working on these problems for decades, and very smart people around the world have been working on these problems. Why don't we have better solutions? My argument in this book is because from the very beginning, we have thought about scaling as an art. I'll tell you the story tonight about why I became interested in working on scaling and why I wrote academic papers. And then ultimately, why did I write a popular book about scaling? Now, my contribution here is I want to add science and a scientific mindset through the lens of economics to lay insights into the notion of scaling. Okay, so that's what I want my contribution with this book to be. Okay, let's turn back the clock now and think about, why did I start to write papers on the science of using science or the science of scaling? My scaling road effectively began with a field experiment. And I had been doing field experiments since the early 90s in economics. This particular field experiment became very special to me. There's a community called Chicago Heights, which is a small community that's just south of the city of Chicago. And they called me and asked me to help them. This is a city that the modern economy has left behind. It was once a very proud manufacturing town, and now those jobs are gone. You have boarded up buildings, boarded up restaurants, you have houses that are falling apart, and you have families that have fallen apart. I said, of course I will help you. That's the least I can do. That's our jobs as professors and social scientists. And I said, let's start with public education. And in America, we don't start compulsory schooling until kindergarten or when someone is 6 years old. So I said, what I want to do with some partners, Roland Fryer and Steve Levitt, I want to start our own pre-K program, a school for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in this community. Now, this is a soup to nuts job. I had to hire janitors, teachers, get the licenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, school buses, lunches, soup to nuts. So what we find is in 2014, some results start to arrive. And now I become very proud of our program, because the program is not only testing the education production function. So now I can write academic papers about the early education production function, but it's also helping these kids. Now, at this point in 2014, I notice that we are moving cognitive test scores, we are moving executive function skills. These are useful surrogates or predictors of how well these kids are going to do in the future. So I'm very proud. Now comes the slap in the face. I start to tell policymakers about my idea and how I want the world to have my curriculum. I'm not trying to sell it. I'm trying to give away my curriculum. Here's a typical response. Professor List, your program had an impressive benefit profile, but don't expect it to happen at scale. Of course, I say, well, wait a second here. I've been doing field experiments for 25 years. What are you talking about? They said, you know, it doesn't have the silver bullet. I said, well, what does this silver bullet mean? And where do I find a half dozen or dozen of them? Because I want to buy some. They said, you know, all of the experts tell us certain interventions will work. But when we scale them, when we take them to other communities or try to grow them, the treatment results are never close to what they promise. So now I became really interested because this was new for me. And I said to them, why do you think that's the case? And they pointed me to a literature of implementation scientists. So these tend to be psychologists and statisticians who are working effectively on what should we do with implementation and what are the best approaches? And they were typically arguing that the main reason why a result might not hold up in the large is because of fidelity. What they effectively mean is that in a drug trial, if you give people in the treatment group a pink pill, when you scale it up, you might give them a purple pill. So essentially, you're giving a different program. Okay, so now I looked at all of this and I said, the first thing I want to determine is it true that what happens in the small is different in many cases than what happens in the large? That's what I call the voltage effect. This is what happens from the Petri dish. And then when you scale that up to the large, what the policymakers were saying was 100% correct. When you look at the mounds and mounds of ideas in the private world and in the public world, there is a voltage effect. Okay, so now my next job was to start thinking about, well, how does this change the way we do research? And I started to think about how I had conducted research. So it was typically, I had an idea, I raced back to my office and I wrote down a model. And then I thought about what's the best way to generate data. Now, let me be clear. The book speaks to both data that are generated in an experiment and data from the wilds. Okay, so my book talks about both. This is not just exclusive about the experimental method. This is about any idea and how we should think about scaling it. Okay, that's how broad these implications are. Now, my career up until 2014 was all about generating data to test theory and to explore mechanisms. That's how you get published in big journals. That's the secret. Now, I started to think, well, if you really want to change the world and create ideas or policies that scale, how should we think about the science behind that expectation? And what I was met with was a bunch of art and gut feelings at this moment. So then I started to think, if we are primarily concerned with scaling a program, how should we change our initial research ideas and our initial research approach if what we are after is to change the world? And that's what I talk about in the book, and that's what I'll talk a little bit about tonight, because it will cause you to change your research approach. Okay, so where did we start? Any good economist will start out by writing down economic theory. That's exactly what we did. We wrote down models to look at in the knowledge creation market in academia, are there typical constraints or incentives that by themselves cause a voltage effect? There are. Okay, and we wrote about those in early papers. Then we started to say, well, what about the theory of the actual implementation? Can we use game theory and economics to learn about this game with researchers, policymakers, practitioners, funders, and participants, and how we go from an initial result to larger scale? Okay, so we put all of that together. I'm I'm only going to have one equation tonight, so I will not give you the typical economics talk. But we put all these equations together, and then we combine it with what I call DNA evidence. And what this is essentially a process whereby I'm using the economic theory to help guide me where to look in the data. So I have an idea or a ton of ideas, and I want to look at the DNA of that idea and figure out what is the DNA of an idea that flourished at scale, and what is the DNA of an idea that petered out or had a huge voltage drop. Okay. Now, if you want to read some academic work, I will advise you to get the voltage effect. But if you want to see the nuts and bolts behind the voltage effect, and you want to read economist and get some jargon and talk about math, a few papers are listed here. The second one, we learn a lot from the medical literature. The medical literature has these same problems. In particular, they're constantly grappling with medication adherence, which turns out to be a very important problem. Now, the grueling theory in math is in this paper titled The Science of Using Science in the International Economic Review. We also have a public policy, an entire issue in this journal called Behavioral Public Policy, where we lay out the implications of the economics model, and then we invite 8 to 10 people from all over the world, sociologists, statisticians, implementation scientists, to comment on our economic model. That's how we learn. We talk across fields. We shouldn't write an economic paper and then go hide in our office. You get nothing done that way. And then we also have published an edited book. This is 22 different academics who are writing about scaling of early childhood through their lenses. Okay, so all of this is contained also in the voltage effect, but you strip out all the economies. Okay, so now let's talk about where the policymakers were wrong. Remember, what I said was they said there was a typical voltage effect. There is a voltage effect. But where they were wrong is this is not a silver bullet problem. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's what I would call an Anna Karenina problem, or a weakest link problem. So think about Leo Tolstoy's famous novel, Anna Karenina. The book starts with a famous first line. Happy families are all alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Scaling is identical. Scalable policies are all alike. Each unscalable policy is unscalable in its own way. But I pinpoint the 5 vital signs that cause policies to go off the rails and not scale. So I don't have a dimensionality problem now. I'm giving you the 5 dimensions. Now, these 5 vital signs give you an indication of the breadth and depth of your idea. If you're happy with what they tell you, you scale it. If you're not happy, the vital signs show you where you can make improvements. And that's important. Again, whether it's experimental data or non-experimental data, the same type of principles and classification will work. Okay? Now, the last half of the book talks about how we can use everyday economics to make our own lives better. So after you launch an idea, or if you just want to use economics to make your world better, that's the back half of the book. And I call this 4 little behavioral economic secrets. And I'll get to that just in a few slides at the end. Okay, let's talk about some of the vital signs. So what I'm doing now is I will give you the 5 principal reasons why ideas fail or why they have success. So this is basically a scouring of the idea space and putting them into buckets. The very first important point is your idea has to have voltage. Okay, I find ubiquitously that the inference problem is oftentimes violated. And what I mean by that is you have some data, whether it's from an experiment or not, and the original data are lying to you. Your sample that you drew is not representative of the population. It's called statistical error. Now, the import of replication in getting more data becomes very clear at this point. So let's go through the check example. I promise this will be the only equation I use tonight. So this is taken from an AER paper, an American Economic Review paper that I wrote with 2 co-authors. So what I define here is the post-study probability. Okay, so that's a function of the power of your test multiplied by the prior. So that's what's the probability that you think the result will be true, that roughly speaking. And then we have this alpha in here, and we usually set that at 5%. That's called, my results are significant at the 5% level. Okay. So now let's pretend that this prior is one that you're very skeptical about whether my Chicago Heights program will work. You only think it has a 1% chance. Now, I have a really well-powered experiment. And so now I've placed some question marks here. So this, I want you to think about after you read an academic paper, think to yourself about whether you think that is a set of results that tells you the program will work. Most of the time when I do this survey amongst policymakers and business people, what they will tell you is if it's in an academic journal, it means it's the truth and it will work. Let's click and see exactly what this turns into. With one replication, it's only 10%. Okay, now what that tells you is with that idea in one replication, you are only 10% confident that the idea is a true result. That's very different than the way people think about this problem. So you can say, well, what about after a second replication? It goes to 0.47. What about a third one? 0.91. So just a few replications can give us a lot of confidence around the question, should I scale this idea? We don't replicate enough, and this shows you why. Again, whether it's an experiment or just data from the real world, we need to be more serious about determining, does your idea have voltage? Now, of course, I don't write about any of that I don't put math in my book. The book is meant for a popular audience. So I tell that mathematical story through examples. In America, a really famous example is the DARE program. So a lot of you might remember Nancy Reagan. She was a wonderful first lady in the 1980s. She was married to President Ronald Reagan. Her goal was to stop teenagers from using drugs. So she used what's called a social inoculation campaign and told teens, just say no to drugs. Now, that program did not work. It didn't work because the initial data were lying to Nancy Reagan about whether the program worked or not. And even though we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this program, it never had voltage. We wasted all of Nancy Reagan's time, millions of dollars, and all kinds of resources trying to scale a policy that never had voltage. This happens all the time. Okay. Vital sign number 2 here, I'm going to leave as question marks. That will give you some incentive. As an economist, I need to set up incentives for you to read the book. And I'm going to jump to vital sign number 3. And this vital sign is titled, is it the chef or is it the ingredients? So this is digging into the properties of the situation. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. In your mind, I want you to think about horizontal scaling and vertical scaling. So horizontal scaling, what I mean is I had a program that worked in Chicago. Does it work in London? Does it work in Tokyo? Does it work in Los Angeles? That's horizontal scaling. Vertical scaling is making it bigger in the same input market. Okay, I have one pre-K program in Chicago. What if I want 10,000? And that's a totally different calculus than horizontal scaling. Now, when you vertically scale and when you think about scaling, a lot of times what happens in the large is you meet new constraints. Exactly as what happened in the intro. You have regulatory constraints, you have infrastructure constraints, you have input constraints. Do the administrators buy in? A big problem with a lot of policies that don't scale is the administrators never buy in and they never give the program at scale that they should be giving. That's a very important problem that we face in the developing world and in the Western world. Now, going back to Chicago Heights, I only had to hire 30 teachers for my program. If you want to vertically scale, you're going to have to hire 30,000 teachers. That's a problem now because humans don't scale. That's why I called it the chef or the ingredients. If a restaurant has big success and it's because of the chef, unique humans don't scale. So when that kind of restaurant tries to scale, it will fail every time. But if the success is based on ingredients and those ingredients can be replicated at scale, now we're in business, because that's a scalable idea because it can be replicated in many different settings. The same with my teachers. My program demanded really good teachers. That was a non-negotiable in my program. Now that is important to detail for the policymaker because that gives you an indication. If you can't hire really good teachers, don't try to scale my program. Okay. Now, the 4 key results, I'm going to dig a little bit more into this because I think we have a lot of policymakers on here. The 4 key results is the fidelity is increased if the facilitators themselves understand the whys behind the intervention. So if you can talk to the facilitators and tell them, here's our program, and this is why it works, they will be much more faithful to the program when you scale it up. Technology, use it whenever you can because of standardization, correct dosage, etc. In many cases, we have the wrong program that's scaled. Technology helps us to combat that feature, that bug of scaling. We should always be telling the policymaker within our idea, what are the negotiables? Those are the things that can change at scale. And what are the non-negotiables? Those are the features of the idea that you cannot change. Those need to be in place at scale. These are very, very important considerations that we give to policymakers, and policymakers should demand those from scientists. You should demand us to tell you, what are your non-negotiables? And if we tell you what they are, and you know you can't meet those at scale, you have to go back to the lab and give a new idea that has negotiables that you can provide at scale. Always use the original scientist on the implementation team. Whenever you have a team implementing, whenever the original scientist is part of it, it is a key consideration when talking about fidelity. But it's beyond that. These are just different mindsets that you have at the table. When I talk to scientists, this is going on in the scientist's mind. That's good, but you need more. You need also what's going on in the policymakers' minds. These are what an economist would call perfect complements. We want them both at the table, and we want them both scaling. That's very important when it comes to making sure you don't have voltage drops. Now, what I'm proposing here is that usually when we do an experiment, we do an A/B test. Great. If we're ambitious, we also do a mechanism test. And what I mean by that is you do A/B, and then you do some sub-treatments to figure out why is A working better than B. That's the whys behind. or the mechanism. And then if we get really ambitious, we might do some heterogeneity tests. And what I mean by that is we block on male or female, or we block on age, or we block on race to figure out, does it work for one group of people better than others? That's the state of the art right now. What I'm proposing here is we don't stop there, but we consider elements of the situation. And we think about, at scale, maybe I can't hire really good teachers. So in the Petri dish, I need to explore whether my idea works with the types of teachers I can hire. That's policy-based evidence. And that is totally changing around the typical way in which we think about this problem is to create evidence-based policy. That's great for an efficacy test. It is no good for a scale. If you're thinking about scaling, you need to take the constraints that you're going to face, whether they're regulatory constraints or human-centric constraints or political will constraints, resource constraints, infrastructural constraints, whatever. You need to bring those back to the Petri dish and explore, does my idea still have voltage with those warts? If it does, you have a scalable idea. If it doesn't, you have to face, maybe we shouldn't scale this idea, or we need to change elements of it. Now, another feature that I see oftentimes not done correctly is after the program is rolled out, policymakers tend to do it in a way that makes it very difficult to measure if the program's working. This is a big mistake. I'm not telling you that you have to do an experiment now when you roll it out, but just roll it out in a way that allows an analyst to figure out if it's working or not. Because this can't be, we roll out a policy and now we're done. It needs to be a constant improvement and constant exploration of, is our idea working or not? And if it's not, we have to have ways to improve upon it. That's how this should be working. It's a constant feedback cycle. It's not just one and done. Okay. Now, in the business world, there's kind of a fun example about smart thermostats. I don't know, do you have smart thermostats in Japan? These are thermostats that you put in your house, and they're smart in that they moderate the temperature and they save on carbon emissions and they save on energy. Aya, do you have this in Japan?
Maybe we do, but not in my house.
Okay. So we explored the efficacy of these. And do you recognize this picture? You might not, because this is a very American-centric person here. This is called Commander Spock. And he is the ultra-rational, he never makes a mistake when he makes decisions. Okay, this is like the University of Chicago normative economist. When they rolled out these smart thermostats, the engineers assumed that the people using them were like Commander Spock. They would never make mistakes. And then they estimated these large effects from the smart technology. So what we did is we rolled out this technology to hundreds of thousands of households in California. And we measured, does the technology work? Guess what we found? We found a big zero. The technology doesn't work because humans are like Homer Simpson. Humans are like me. I have one of these in my house. And guess what I did? Immediately, I undid the default or the presets in the smart technology. That's what Homer Simpson would do. And that's exactly what hundreds of thousands of households do. And they undo all of the good stuff. And in the end, you have a big zero. You need to understand this is part of the situation, right? This is part of what we're scaling into. Humans make mistakes. That's what behavioral economics is about, systematic mistakes. Okay, let's move to vital sign number 4. And this is a world that development economists have thought about. and they've thought about this a lot, the unintended consequences or the spillovers in our idea. Okay, there are a lot of different ways to think about spillovers. One way that I talk about in the book was what happened to me at Uber. So I used to be the chief economist at Uber. And in 2017, late January, there was a major campaign that went on Twitter titled the Delete Uber campaign. And that caused a lot of drivers to quit Uber and a lot of consumers to quit Uber. My team was called Team Ubernomics. And our job was to get the drivers back. Okay. So my idea was, let's introduce tipping in the app. You might not know this, but Uber, until the summer of 2017, you could not tip within the app. You can now. And it's because my team, we rolled it out in the summer of 2017. So what we did to start is we chose a market and we allowed 5% of the drivers to receive tips because we wanted to test what are the effects of having tipping in the app. We found two major things. One, the drivers made more money because of the tips. And two, they worked more hours. So it was a win-win. What do you think happened when we rolled out this idea to all of the drivers in the market? Well, what happened was all the drivers worked more, and there were so many drivers working that they drove around more often with an empty car. So they ended up undoing, through the market equilibrium, the market undid all of the good stuff on the pay increase. And in fact, what we ended up with, the drivers earned exactly the same amount of money per hour after tipping is what the prevailing wage was before tipping. So that was a market-wide effect that undid all of our good stuff. That's one kind of spillover you need to concern yourself with. Another kind was a spillover that we had in our early childhood program. So what we observed here was that our control kids who lived nearby treatment kids, if they lived nearby enough treatment kids, it was like they were in treatment themselves. So this was a great spillover. In economist, this is called a SUTVA violation. This is a violation of our experiment. But in this case, it was a great way to think about, if you scale that now, you're going to have high voltage because the control group was doing too well in our original experiment, and it was too pessimistic when we looked at the original data. And when you have spillovers at scale, great things are happening. So in this chapter, I also talk about network externalities. A lot of our social platforms today are kind of okay in the small, but like, think about Facebook. If none of your friends are on Facebook, it's not very valuable to you. But as you grow the footprint of Facebook, because of network externalities, the good becomes more valuable. So the idea in this chapter is we try to think about ideas that have positive spillovers, and we try to attenuate the negative ones because they can undo all the good stuff at scale. Okay? So the fifth vital sign here, I'm going to leave behind the scenes because I only have 3 minutes left. Again, I'll have you go to the book and explore that. Now, the second half of the book, just for a few moments, it's really using economics to have a better life. It's how we should think about using incentives. Incentives are much more than just financial incentives. I then talk about revolution on the margins, and this is trying to get people to think in a marginal way. Now, oftentimes we hear that, but we really don't learn what it means. So this hit me in when I was working in the White House, as was mentioned, we were talking about how much money we should spend on cleaning up hazardous waste sites. So I was looking at some data, and there were some East Coast hazardous waste sites that what the data were telling me is that it was about $2.5 million on average to save each of 1,000 lives when we cleaned it up. And then when you compared the data from the Midwest of America, what you found was it was about $3 million on average to save each life. So if you just looked at the averages, you would say the next tranche of money, we should clean up East Coast sites because it's cheaper per life saved. But if you think on the margin, let's say what happened in the last 10 lives. On the East Coast, it was 8 million for the last 10. And on the Midwest, it was only 4 million for the last 10. So if you think on the margin, thinner slices of data, this will tell you now, well, wait a second, the next tranche of money we should use for Midwest cleanup, not East Coast, because we get twice as much voltage. That's thinking on the margin. Okay, so chapter 8, I talk about quitting. I argue that we don't quit enough. And we don't quit enough in part because society tells us that quitting is a repugnant word. And we also don't think about opportunity cost of time. Okay, so I unpack that in chapter 8. Chapter 9, I talk about culture. And I talk about how to build culture in an organization. Now here I talk a lot about the gender pay gap. As I mentioned, about a lot of my work is about why do women get paid less money than men doing identical jobs? Why don't women negotiate as much as men, etc.? How can we create a diverse and inclusive workforce? That's what chapter 9 is about. Okay, so that's a whirlwind tour of the voltage effect. And wow, right on time, 6:50. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn it back over to the organizers. And I want to say thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much, Professor List, for the fantastic talk on the book. I've been reading the book, but it was much more clear now, having your talk. It was very eye-opening in a sense that, we've been talking about evidence-based policy, in Japan too, but he's saying that it's all outdated. We have to think about policy-based evidence. So, and then the scale up, I guess it's related to, external validity that we always talk about in academia. So those are really fascinating points. Thank you very much. So we like to move on to the panel discussion on the theme, how can we scale up good ideas in the development field? In the field of development economics, the number of empirical studies that use experimental or quasi-experimental methods has been increasing over the past decades. And I actually wanted to share one slide. Is it shared? Hopefully. Yeah. So this is just one of the work that one of my PhD student and I did. We reviewed that top four journals in development economics and look at how, sorry. Yeah. Is it? I feel like it's not really shared well. Wait, let me share it again. Okay. Well, anyway, so the number of experimental studies over this past decade increased a lot. So RCT is this red, the share, and then this blue one is the, including quasi-experimental methods and lab in the field and natural experiment. It increased from 14% to, almost like half of the papers use experimental methods. Like EDCC, 90% are experimental studies in 2020. So it's really increasing. And the types of, the area they use experiments also widened over this 10 years. So it seems like, there are, there are lots of evidences in our field. Yeah, so we can see that evidence based on these experimental studies have been accumulated over the years in this field. But are these kinds of evidence really used in practice? Do they meet the demand of policymakers and practitioners who want scales? Have we considered whether our ideas are scalable, based on Professor List's vital science? So we like to talk about this theme, and we have a fascinating group of panelists today who have experience and knowledge both in academia and practice. We have three of them. I'd like to start with Professor Sawada, then Dr. Megumi Muto of JICA, and then Professor Mushfiq Mubarak. I'll first introduce Professor Sawada. Professor Sawada is a professor at the Faculty of Economics, University of Tokyo. His key research areas are development economics, microeconometrics, economics of disasters, field surveys, and experiments. From March 2017 until August 2021, he was chief economist of the Asian Development Bank and the director general of its economic research and regional cooperation department. He has worked with well-known development and economic organizations, among them JICA, World Bank, Economic Research Institute of ASEAN and East Asia, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, and Bangladesh Institute of Development Studies. Professor Sawada has obtained his PhD in economics from Stanford University. So with this, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Sawada.
Thank you very much, Aya. And actually, as Aya said, I quitted chief economist position of ADB last year. I was so much encouraged to read chapter 8 of this really fascinating book. Thank you very much, John, for a really wonderful lecture and also a fascinating new book. And like your previous book already mentioned by Aya, the Why Axis, this book really provides us with valuable insights, not only for business decision, personal, individual decisions, but also full of public policy implication. And I think that this is a really relevant guide to decision makers of ADB client countries and ADB itself. And actually, as I mentioned, the Why Axis, the previous book was titled その問題経済学で解決できます. Literally means that your problem, economists can give you the right solution. So I thought the last book already provided everything, but happy to know there are further secrets of our decision making. So one of my take-home messages is from this voltage effect book is shown in this first slide. We are all surrounded by goods and services which went through very rigorous voltage effects, and we are surrounded by survived ones. So after this reading book, I feel that we observe the consequences of voltage effects all around us and everywhere. Today, all of us are using Zoom here, and also I'm using PDF. Not long ago, we were using transparencies on overhead projector. While waiting for arrival of this hard copy, I got the soft copy of this book from Amazon and Kindle version. I'm using a LED lamp, relatively recently voltage gained, and candles voltage dropped long time ago. We are on extremely large mega scaled water system, and we are using this system probably 100 years ago. This system gained the voltage. And also work from home in Tokyo, we often use Uber Eats and Kumon method of learning down left. This is a self-learning at the right level method, originally from Japan, spread over more than 50 countries, serving to more than 3.5 million students. And not to mention BTS and Korean music and entertainment products penetrated global markets. And this happened quite recently. And umami seasoning powder Ajinomoto spread all over Asia, Africa, and other countries. And not to mention Toyota cars run all over the world, as mentioned in this voltage effect book. So I started feeling our world is composed of these voltage gain goods and services, survived ones, recently or even 100 years ago. And this book provided with the mechanism behind our whole life ecosystem through the lens of big 5 signs, as John really nicely shared with us. and that first half, and also for behavioral secrets, this book devoted the last half. So I have a final slide summarizing my questions. I have been really enjoying reading this book in last few days, and I came up with many questions, but I'd like to invite John's further insight on these following three issues. Number one is a big question first. Whether gains and drops of voltage effects, whether this can lead to ultimately overall maximum social welfare or efficient resource allocation in long run. Or we need some type of intervention, say a competition policy or antitrust policy. So this is a big question. I'd like to ask John, as a Chicago economist, what's your view about long-term consequences of our society? In this book, seeing a fair story, especially the company called ADBI, really groundbreaking science-based wellness service. I thought this is really wonderful products, but this failed. So I thought that this is not warranted. Most efficient or most viable technology can survive through the market forces, and we may be stuck to second best equipment such as a QWERTY typewriting system. So that's my first question I'd like to ask. Fixed cost barrier in number 5 sign, John didn't talk about yet, but this fixed cost barrier may manifest itself as some type of a market failure. Say the case of Arrival, credit financial market failure is really a substantial barrier. So, and also John touched upon Adam Smith's individual hands in the second half, and talking about margin effects. But I wonder whether we need some policy intervention ultimately to guide whole process of voltage moving for the right direction. So this is a first question I'd like to ask, a big question. And if I may, second and third, I'd like to postulate first. Second question, ADB Asian Development Bank and JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. One of the main operations is financing very large scale infrastructure investment. For example, ADB's original capital resources, operations loans outstanding as of the end of 2020 was amounted to 130 billion US dollars. That's outstanding loan. And out of this 130 billion US dollars, 27% went into transport infrastructure, road and railway, and hard physical infrastructure, and 18% is on the energy sector. So by nature, this infra bypasses the voltage gain process. And because we cannot do A/B test quickly. And so immediately, this infrastructure project scaled successfully or unsuccessfully. So I'd like to invite, what's the important insight out of this your book? And you emphasize the cost-benefit analysis. This is a norm for infrastructure investment. And also number 3 sign of the book, talking about the compliance issue, lack of compliance. And sometimes we see, infrastructure funded by these aid agency or government agency underutilized. So I would imagine there is some fundamental compliance issue and mismatch is there. So I'd like to invite your insights on the infrastructure. And finally, but not least, many people, including myself, got really excited to know your new endeavor of JP Micro, Journal of Political Economy Micro. And so I wonder, can you discuss issue of strengthening overall voltage gains in Ivory Tower and our academic society? This book extensively discusses incentives of researchers, but it's eye-opening to know necessity of evidence evidence-based policymaking should be transformed into a policy-based evidence. So I think whole these stories, I was wondering what's the important insights of the book for whole academic, community. So these are three big questions I wanted to postulate, and I really appreciate your insights, further insights on this. But again, thank you very much for this really fascinating, wonderful book and lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yasu. John would like to reply for this.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful if I could take a few moments and reply. Yasu, that's excellent. I loved your first slide, and I really like your questions too. Thank you so much for your kind words, and thanks for your thoughtfulness. The first question is really about a long-run equilibrium and whether we might want to think about, let's say, implementing incentives in the system. Now, we always have to take care before we have government intervention and all of the problems. As a Chicago economist, I don't want to turn in my Chicago economics card. I don't want Milton Friedman to roll over. But I do feel that there is a role here in terms of providing the correct incentives to get, let's say, great ideas in public policy making and great ideas in the private world. So you can imagine something like the National Science Foundation having an organization that is willing to fund the kind of work that does policy-based evidence. You can imagine in government having scale-up units. So the fact that we don't have scale units within organizations, I think, is a real problem. Every organization, government or private, should have a group who is primarily responsible for, will this idea scale, and can we test the features of it? Now, the fact that companies come and go and there's entry and exit, I think about that as a healthy market. I think if you didn't have that, it would be unhealthy. So let's be clear that entry and exit and people losing money and making a lot of money, to me, that's good stuff. But are there enough market failures for the government to come in and do some soft touches? I think so. And I think it's along the lines of incentivizing more people to do policy-based evidence. So that's answer number one. Number two is a great question, and I'm happy to say that DARPA is an arm in the US government that funds big shots, and they fund really high potential ideas. DARPA likes the voltage effect thinking, and DARPA now has invited me to work with them to help them choose projects that are good bets, because they see that this is more than just art. It's a difficult question to pick winners and who you think will be winners, but you can add science to this process. I think this is all around the world that we should be doing this, adding science to this particular process. Now, you brought up something important, that if you have an idea that it's really hard to get data around, like building a new bridge or having internet access, just because you can't get data does not mean it's a bad thing. And it also does not mean that you can't use my insights. My insights are a framework that should help you think through which ideas you want to scale. So even if you don't have data, going over my 5 principles is a checklist. Without data is still helpful. I do this all the time. There are cases where you just won't have data. There are cases where you won't have experimental data. You'll have bits of data. That's fine. You can still use the principles of the voltage effect. And I urge everyone to think through problems in this way. So that's number 2. Number 3, I'm glad you asked. So this is my new baby. My new baby is an economics journal called the Journal of Political Economy Micro. And I've been doing the editorship for the Journal of Political Economy for now over 3 years. I'm going to continue to do that. I'm going to continue to do that while I start up a new journal that will have the Chicago footprint, but will be focusing on micro. Okay. Now you might say, how's he using his research or the voltage effect? Let's look at chapter 6. In chapter 6, I talk about the clawback incentive. So the clawback is something I did around China. I've done it all over the world. And that is essentially reversing the way we do bonuses. Usually we do bonuses by saying you work for a while, maybe a year, and at the end of the year, you get your Christmas bonus. What I do in this approach is I give the incentive up front. Here's your money provisionally. And over the year, all you can do is lose some of it. So that's leveraging loss aversion. And what I find is it makes people work harder. It also serves as a commitment device. So every one of my editors who I've hired for JPE Micro is being paid with a clawback incentive. That comes from chapter 6 of the book. Secondly, the book also makes clear that we need more replication. And within the academic system, we're not serious enough about replication in the social sciences. I'm changing that. Every issue that we have in JPE Micro or every other issue or so will have a replication paper in it. We need to send a signal to our profession that replication is important. It's not only important for scaling, but as Ayu said, it's important for external validity, which is a part of scaling, but not the entire thing. We need to understand, is this result real? And as I showed you, with my check program, even if you're very skeptical at the beginning, one study doesn't get you very far. It's still very skeptical about whether it's true or not. We need to reward people who do replications, and we need to respect those like the hard scientists do. In the hard sciences, you have an exploration that gets published in Science or Nature. That's great. But then the replication does too. We got to get serious about this. If we want to take on serious problems, we need to have serious people and serious incentives to take those on. And that's what the new journal is doing. Thanks for asking about it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So JP Micro is really voltage effect in practice.
It's high voltage, Yasu. High voltage.
Really fascinated. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your comments.
Okay, thank you very much. We are behind the time, so let me move on. So let me introduce Dr. Megumi Muto. Prior to her appointment as Vice President in February 2021, Dr. Megumi Muto has held leadership role at Ogata Sadako Research Institute for Peace and Development, Global Environment Department, and at France office. During 2010 to 2015, she was responsible for the Philippines and the Pacific. Dr. Muto has written extensively in the area of impact evaluation. She has also co-led the World Bank ADB JICA book on the impact of climate change on Asian coastal megacities. She holds a PhD in development economics, master in public affairs, and executive master of business administration. So please, Dr. Muto.
Thank you very much, Aya Sensei, and thank you very much, Professor List, for giving me the opportunity to read your great book. It really had a voltage effect on me, or I should say a Pikachu effect on me, if I say from my Japanese background. When I read your book, there was a clear central thread, which goes like this: look at your comparative advantage and serve the market well using science. That's how I paraphrase your central message. And based on that, I have one reflection and one comment. The reflection is on some types of operations in JICA, my organization. JICA has a scheme to support Japanese SMEs to expand their market in developing countries all over the world. We have a data set of more than 1,000 cases already. Sorry, this slide is just half in English, half in Japanese, but this is the result. I mean, how we are dealing with this program. What we do is supporting the initial research cost and continue monitoring. 70% of them continue their operations in the new market after the research. And among that, 70% report positive sales, meaning 49 of the SMEs keep on going. However, in terms of scalings, my colleagues share with me that the ratio is much lower. Next slide, please. Just to explain to you how are these, what are the typical cases. This is on-site treatment sanitation in India. And then the next slide is, online classroom app in Cambodia. The Ministry of Education and the National Broadcast Company adopted them. So it has a potential. But now, as an institution as a whole, what should we do to improve in terms of scaling these? First, the project managers, both at JICA and the SME, should go over the 5 vital signs. Was the data false positive? Any unintended spillovers? What's the upfront cost? When do we break even? But aren't we sticking too much to the sunk cost? I personally think the last one is particularly tricky because in the real world, we build trust by fidelity on people and approach. And the moment we have to change that, we have a managerial kind of like a situation where we really they have to manage it really well. So for project leaders in development, I recommend reading chapters 1 to 5 to make your project scalable, create a comparative advantage within yourself and in the project. And in addition, for higher ups and older ones, read chapters 6 and 9 to transform your institution. That is to create the best enabling framework, working on things like incentives at scale, think in terms of margins, when to create and scaling culture. Make sure the program designs are not based on false positive. And most importantly, check if you yourself have the comparative advantage to serve that market of solving problems of your institution. And that's the voltage moment for me. The other issue that I wanted to touch upon, this is more like a comment, is the emerging world of impact investment. The book talks about CSR, ESG, and other great purpose-oriented projects. The private sector, in particular, the capital market and the banking sectors, are increasingly looking for impact investment opportunities, including Japan. Of course, they need the usual risk-return profile, but they are very keen to add the angle of impact to the society and planet, but that should be very much measurable. I happened to join the discussions with the impact investment community in Japan and globally, and there, doing an upfront experimental or RCT test is considered as a maybe luxury. It's heavy and also maybe not too feasible. Instead, people are looking for alternative solutions using the kind of these alternative data and well-formulated theory of change. How to improve the scalability ratio and at the same time being efficient on finding the right approach and target market is really an imminent issue for this growing impact community. And I think someone should have comparative advantage to serve this growing market. And it is a very promising field for young economists, I think. And I'm very glad that Professor List just mentioned that even if there's no data, we can use a theory and other principles of this book to start thinking about this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Muto. Professor List, would you like to reply quickly, maybe?
Yeah. So very quickly, those are great words of wisdom, and you have clearly read the book carefully, and you are very smart. So thank you very much for your comments. I will say that where you went at the end, I've been working a lot on the science of philanthropy, and I've developed an initiative called the Science of Philanthropy Initiative. And that's not only to think about what are the best ways to convince people to give to a charitable cause and keep them committed, but it's also to measure what is our impact or what is our footprint on the goods and services that we're providing to the world. It's important because we want to make sure we're not wasting charitable dollars, but we also can come back and make our programs better if they're not working. And the approach in the book, you can use that for these types of, whether it's putting a smile on a young child's face. I work with the Make-A-Wish Foundation and I help them raise money. And you can say, well, how do you value that? As economists, we can value everything. And people who want return on the investment, whether it's an investor or whether it's a person who's giving dollars to a charitable campaign, we always have to seek to make sure that their ROI, and measured in those terms, is appropriate, because that's how we grow the charitable pie. So in another research agenda that I've been working on for the last 25 years is exactly here. So I'm so happy you mentioned that, because that is as important as the bottom line for many firms, and for society, it's even more important, because there are market failures in public goods that are just not provided, and we need firms to step up. So I really appreciate your comments.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have the last panelist, Professor Ahmed Mushrifik Mubarak. Actually, he's today in Sierra Leone, and we're gonna show you a recorded video. But he's a professor of economics at Yale University with concurrent appointments at the School of Management and in the Department of Economics. He's a founder of the faculty director of the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale, YRISE. And he holds other appointments at Innovation for Poverty Action, the International Growth Center at LSE, and the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, JPAL, at MIT. Okay, so could you share the movie? Yes, yes.
Hi, good morning and good evening, everybody. So this is Mushrifik Mubarak. Thank you so much for inviting me to our organizers at the ADBI Institute, as well as the University of Tokyo, for inviting me to share some thoughts on John's excellent new book, which I have here with me in Sierra Leone. This was my airplane reading. And of course, first of all, congratulations, John, on putting this together. I learned a tremendous amount from reading your book. And what's amazing about it for a researcher like myself is not only the anecdotes that you share from your researcher hat on, but also many of the anecdotes you share from the other hats, the many other impressive hats that you wear as chief economist of Uber, then Lyft, and consulting in very many varied spaces, such as working with a school district or actually designing and running your own school and curriculum. Right? So in my, scaling is of course a tremendously important issue. So in my 5 minutes, what I'd like to do is spend just a little bit of time on talking to the audience that I normally speak to the most, which is other researchers, and to say a little bit about what I think the challenge is for us that John has thrown down, right? Because obviously doing scaling properly is an important business decision, an important marketing decision, but it's also an important challenge for us researchers to try and figure out, okay, what types of public policies should we be supporting and promoting when thinking about the complexities of scaling and all of the uncertainties and new challenges that might be thrown up, even after we say evaluate some public policies or pilot some programs and learn that it's effective. Okay, so in my field in development economics, this has become one of the most central questions, in that as those of you who followed development economics for the past few years must have noticed that we've been doing a lot of program evaluation, right? So randomized control trials have become very popular as a way to evaluate development programs. So why do we evaluate these programs using randomized control trials? We do it because we want to answer the question, if this program were to be scaled up as policy, would it continue to have an important effect on people's lives, right? Now, when we do the original pilot scale trial, right, similar to John's story about running a wellness program with a motor company. Okay? So the answer that we get from that early evaluation, that pilot program evaluation, is an important input into the decision on whether to scale, right? We'd like to learn whether or not, even at a pilot scale, does this program work, right? But just because something does work at a pilot scale, right, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work equally well at scale, because even if that trial is well designed, the randomized control trial is extremely well designed, it's a great research project, right? It does not necessarily give us the exact answer that we are looking for, right? It's like the world has fundamentally changed as we move to scale. Okay? And similarly, just because something did not work at pilot scale does not necessarily mean that the program is doomed, that it wouldn't work under aggregate conditions. Okay? So therefore, for researchers like myself and our field, we need to understand, okay, how do we make these inferences moving from the pilot scale trial into the possible effectiveness at scale. Okay? And so we've been thinking sort of systematically about this. And the reason it's important for us to think systematically about this is, in the development economics field, we're stuck at this place now where, you know, we insist on evidence-based policy. So we say, okay, you need to do randomized control trials or equally rigorous techniques to evaluate programs, right? And then we say we evaluate the first program or the pilot scale version of the program, we learn something, and then you say, okay, now we got to figure out how to scale it up, okay? And in that second stage, we're not actually doing all that much rigorous research. So in fact, you know, for evidence-based policymaking, we're insisting on very rigorous evidence on the first stage, the piloting, but we're kind of forgetting that lesson for the second stage, right? So we need to think systematically and carefully about how does one apply the same rigorous standards to the scaling question, right? So so I'm like John, I'm also really interested and have become interested in these questions, and I've started to spend a lot of my research life like trying to understand this. And we've set up a research network to do this. It's called the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale, that we're trying to, but it's not just Yale, even though it's Yale based, it's not just Yale researchers, it's a lot of people from around the world trying to think about it. And we try to systematically think through, okay, what are the areas that we need to do research in to answer these questions rigorously, and what are the other fields and disciplines that we need to get inputs from and insights from in order to apply that evidence, rigorous evidentiary standard. So let me just show you one slide to explain exactly what I have in mind here. So what we learn is sometimes when you're running a pilot scale program, a trial, the governments don't notice or care. But when there's a chance that this program might get scaled up, of course, at that point, governments will notice, they'll react to it. The politicians will react to it. It might affect their incentives. They might, they might try to take credit for the program, right? There's a lot of things that could happen that we do need political scientists and economists to help us think through carefully. Now, John talks a lot about external validity. So in fact, in the Chrysler example that he gives, it's a lot about failure of external validity. So the program works in one particular factory, right, but fails to replicate in other factories. So we need to understand, how do we, if we have these different answers from different factories, or we get one answer from Bangladesh, another answer from Kenya, another answer from Peru, how do we aggregate all that evidence to make a prediction on, okay, in Uganda, is this a program that should be scaled up or not, right? So that requires us to develop some new science. That a lot of that has to come from the field of econometrics on how to aggregate evidence and how to make predictions on the conditions under which this program is more likely to succeed than fail, right? There are lots of spillover effects, so effects on not the direct program beneficiaries, which may not show up at pilot scale, but will become relevant at scale, right? We might also want to think about macroeconomic consequences, the aggregate consequences of programs. And then, as many of the anecdotes in John's book shows, that as you move to scale, there's a different implementer, and that itself may have an effect on the potential success of the program. So those are the things that we form research networks around, and we're trying to sort of build some systematic evidence on. But it's all inspired by the same line of thinking that led to John's book. Okay, so thank you. I'll stop there. And I hope that this conversation continues, that not only around this book, but I hope that John and I can connect in the future about like developing this research agenda along with many other researchers who are in the room today. And I am recording this because I am in rural Sierra Leone. So let me just show you one picture. It's exactly why is it that I had to pre-record this. So in this case, we're trying to scale up a program to get vaccines out to remote rural areas, COVID vaccines. And this is the type of scaling problem that we encounter, right? And we got to solve this problem. And it turns out a new innovation to solve this problem looks something like this: putting vaccines in coolers in the back of a motorbike and sending a nurse along with the vaccines to the place where people need them. Okay, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess, do you have anything to add, John, or should we go into the question from the floor?
Yeah, just for 30 seconds. I am. So Mushfiq, if you're listening or you hear this, thank you so much. Mushfiq is an old friend and I'm a huge fan of his work. He just is doing great stuff. The one element that I really want to point out is there's an old biblical phrase called the pearls before the swine. And I believe that in one sense, we have thought this way about implementation of ideas, where the pearls are the innovation and the idea phase, and then the swine is just implementing it. And we need to think very differently about that. To me, it's like the pearls before the jadeite. And jadeite, if you don't know, is one of the most precious gems and most valuable gems in the earth. And you can have great ideas all day long, and we have them for poverty eradication, for public education, for climate. But we have ideas that work in the pilot or in the petri dish, and they don't work at scale. So if we don't understand the science of using science, we're done. It's a weakest link problem. And I really appreciate that Mushfiq more or less says, look, he and I are kindred spirits. And I think everyone on the call is a kindred spirit because we're understanding that part of the chain is broken. And it's not doing great research to figure out what good ideas are in the petri dish. We do reasonably well at that, put false positives on the sidelines. What we don't do well at is understanding the voltage effect.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we were already, passing that time, but can we go for a few questions? Or is that
absolutely, okay? Aya, of course.
Thank you very much. Sorry. So yeah, there are several questions from the floor. You can also read. The first one is, are there additional considerations, when you want to make scale up in developing countries? Second one is, when the chefs, like the government, leader, politicians are not willing, what effect will the ingredients have? And third one is, how big is a problem of false positives compared to other problems like spillovers? Fourth one, right, so it's asking, do you believe if we require a system to verify scientific validity to see if the ideas are good for scale? So whether should there be a systematic framework to validate if it's good for scaling? And last one, is scaling up something to do with project impact assessment? Are they related or complementary?
Sure. These are great questions. Thank you so much, everyone. And let me try to add some insights for each one. The first one, you're exactly right. In thinking about developing countries, there's a lot more heterogeneity across one country or one village to another than what we typically find in the Western world. And in the Western world, a lot of the constraints come with regulations or laws. And those cause you to think differently in the petri dish, where in the developing community, you have a lot of horizontally scaling issues. And what I mean by that is the people and situations are so heterogeneous that a lot of times those ideas fail because of vital signs 2 and 3. And then if it's a small enough village, vital sign number 4, which is spillovers, those have real impact because when you're doing something at scale in a village, it can disrupt the entire economy. That's what I talk about in that chapter. Mushfiq brought that up too. So I think you're right. In terms of scaling, there are a different set of considerations, but they still all fall under what I talk about in the voltage effect. Now, the next question I think was about, so political will and the chef, if they're not willing, you're right. You can have great ingredients, but if there's a political will problem and the implementers or the chef in charge does not believe in it or does not try to scale it, tries to scale the wrong pill or the wrong program, there's program drift, you're dead. Because remember, this is a weakest link problem. Think about your vehicle, your automobile. If there's one flat tire, you're done. The technology is you're only as good as the weakest link. It's like airport security. Okay, this is not a best shot technology. Think of perfect complements or weakest link technology. The third, I'm glad you asked that, because when you think about internal validity or is there voltage, none of this is worth talking about if you don't have voltage. So it all starts with false positives. It all starts with, if you have an idea that works, you can talk about the rest. If you don't have an idea with voltage, there's no reason to talk about anything else because there's nothing to talk about. It's a little bit like the discussion between internal validity and external validity. What internal validity means is I have a causal parameter. I can make causal inference. If you can't make causal inference, there's no reason to talk about externally valid because there's no causal inference to be made. So that's how I want you to think about it. You have to make sure you have voltage. Now we can talk about the rest. Okay. Now, government tends to make the mistake there at false positives. Firms tend not to, because firms, they try something for a few days, doesn't work, they bring it back. So the import of false positives is very different across governments and for-profit or nonprofits who can recast it back very quickly. The next one, this warms my heart. Gay Wang, you and your friend reading my external validity trial paper, thank you so much. So yes, I think your intuition's right. I can see a similar system in talking about the scientific validity. So that's a paper, if any of you want to read a paper that is a satire about external validity and what we can learn about it, I'm so glad that you're reading that. And that's contained in the voltage effect too. This is strands of the external validity trial. So thanks for bringing that up. And you're right, that this is a scientific validity of ideas. Now, the last one is scaling up. Yeah. So impact assessment starts to tell you whether you have voltage or not. But what I'm saying is in the impact assessment itself, in the program evaluation, you can do more to make it policy-based evidence. So what I'm saying is don't just do A/B. Don't just do program evaluation, do more to tell you from the very beginning, can this thing scale? Can this idea scale? So I'm not saying not to gather evidence. I'm saying continue to gather evidence, but do it in a way that you are taking the scaling idea seriously. And you can do that in your program evaluation. Finally, does the book take into account the social cognition? Yes. So that's part of the third vital sign is social cognition, not only of the participants, but also of the researchers and the practitioners and the policymakers and the people that are rolling out the policy. People make errors and people don't always act in the normative way. And absolutely, Paulo, thanks for your question. That is running through the book too. Remember, this is a book that is not an ivory tower book. It's John List in the real world telling you what he's learned for the last several decades in working with governments in big countries, small countries, firms, big, small, otherwise, nonprofits are in there. So this is sort of a research autobiography of what I think we can learn from my work. And I focus on scaling, but it's much more than that. It's how you can use these lessons to make your lives better. You don't even have to be associated with an organization.
Okay, thank you very much for answering all the questions. Yeah, sorry for my bad time management. We passed
No,
over.
no. That's my fault. I talked too much. I'm sorry.
But thank you again. Please join me once again to thank Professor List for sharing his
Oh,
brilliant
thank you.
insights
Thank you.
on the book and the lecture and all the question and answer sessions. I'm sure this will be a really great book. So please read this book. It's really readable, a very enjoyable book to read. Thank you very much. And I also like to thank the panelists, Professor Sawada, Dr. Muto, and Professor Mubarak in Sierra Leone for their insights. And also I'd like to thank the supporting organizations, ADBI particularly, Dean Sonobe, Dr. Morgan, and Dr. Rahut. TWID, Jade, and Dois of U-Tokyo, Asian Development Bank, and Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale. And I'd like to thank all the participants for joining today to make the event very lively discussion. So thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, and have a nice day.